Well, good morning, everyone. I am Noel Nazario, Federal Sector Senior Director at Anook Incorporated and GWDC Special Events Director. I have the pleasure of hosting the How to Audit Your Cloud part of the program today. And I have three fantastic presenters today with us. Jason Gould, Managing Director at KPMG Federal Practice. Jason has a master's in computer science from James Madison, and he is very experienced in conducting audits in various environments. He holds CISSP, ISACA, and PMP designations, and does a lot of work under government auditing standards. So he's got a lot of experience to share. Phil Moore, a partner and IT assurance practice leader at Kearney and Company. He's a bachelor's and master's from accounting and information systems at Virginia Tech. Has many years of experience in assurance, financial audit, and consulting in civilian and DoD environments. He's currently HHS lead IT consultant and lead partner on various FISMA and FISCAM based audits. Phil is a CPA, a CISA, and a PMP. And Danny Wuckovich, he's a cloud security director with PwC. And he also earned his bachelor's and master's in accounting information systems at Virginia Tech. He's got many years of experience in roles around cybersecurity, technical and program leadership roles, and has experience in financial services, health industries, and technology sectors. He's also a CPA, holds a CISSP and a CISA designation. So welcome to the three of you. So before we get into specific questions, could you please share a summary of your recent work around cloud and your approach to auditing your targets? Danny, could you please get us started?
Sure, Noel. Thanks so much for the introduction. So my team really focuses on modernized technology engineering, and we'll call it workload development because it really depends on whether we're talking about an app, a service, a specific data set, whatever you're trying to do in the cloud, and how we speed up and integrate security so that we're effectively increasing quality without hampering and slowing down the delivery teams. And how do we do that in a compliant fashion per se? So three main objectives: business delivery, security, compliance. And what we're trying to do is find that equilibrium so that the teams aren't flying off the rails. And we're putting up the proverbial guardrails. So depending on where you're looking at the cloud stack, we're working to figure out how we either automate, standardize, or really push security into the processes so that the development, the engineering, the architecture teams are in essence doing security and becoming our frontline security teams.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers the first part.
Sure. Thanks for getting us started. Jason, do you want to
Sure.
give us a little bit of background on you?
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Great. Yeah, again, thank you for having me on this panel. Definitely appreciate it. And yeah, just some background. I've been currently working on auditing various cloud environments, whether it's from a infrastructure as a service, PaaS, or software as a service, it's been. I've been enjoying working with my teams, working with my clients, understanding the delineation as far as where are the security controls, who owns them, and day in, day out, understanding what are the risk points, not only from the IT controls, but also how to, for like a financial statement audit, how do they trickle down into potentially impacting the business process controls? So a lot of course, a lot of coordination, a lot of discussions with management, not only at the customers, but also through coordination with the service providers too.
Thanks, Jason. Phil, tell us a little bit about your involvement and your angle to IT audit.
Great. Hey, thanks, Noel. Thanks for having me as well. So similar to Jason, so we're doing a lot of federal government work here at Kearney and Company, be it FSMA work, where we're looking at the entire IT security program across the agency, or financial statement audit, or basically what you call it, basically internal audit, A123 in the federal government. So we're really looking at management has outsourced their cloud environment. Now, what is manager's responsibilities? When we audit management who's using multiple CSPs, how are they looking at risk? How they understand their controls? I know it was in the last presentation, which was great. They talked about responsibility and inheritance. That's what we're looking at from what we're looking at entities. So if we're looking at an agency and they have multiple cloud providers, are they doing the right thing in monitoring? And then when we do our auditing to look at IT security and risk, how do we understand all the different scopes of the CSPs they're using, be it SaaS, PaaS, et cetera. And then also, we have some projects where we're actually helping the CSPs with their third-party assessors as well. So, which is obviously, what's great is being on both sides, right? We could be the auditor, understanding the cloud environment, looking at the controls, but then on the same side, we're in there with the CSPs, really getting an understanding of how they deal with being compliant and working with the 3 PAOs to be to get that FedRAMP authorization.
All right. Well, thank you, Phil. And while you're talking, when starting an IT audit or cybersecurity audit that includes cloud technology, cloud environment, what are the first things you consider during your planning?
Yeah, I think the key is scope, and I know it was talked about a lot in the last presentation. What is the true scope of the cloud provider as it relates to your audits? Most audits have a different goal. You're not just doing an audit just to do an audit. You have a distinct goal in it. So either it's a financial statement audit, a FSMA audit, or some type of other audit that you're doing. How does the cloud provider address that scope? And don't assume that cloud provider is the only one. We're getting into situations to where we're noticing a SaaS is sitting on a PaaS, is sitting on an IaaS, and even the IaaS might have some outsourced elements to it. So it's becoming very complicated. So if you just maybe audit the SaaS, you're missing a lot of controls that SaaS is inheriting for all the different layers. So really getting understanding the scope, what is their responsibilities? And then kind of talking to management about what they are responsible for. So a lot of times we'll have discussions really early in the process of, do you get a SOC 1 type 2 report or a SOC 2 report to get an understanding of the environment? And then one of my audits right now, we actually have regular meetings with the SOC 1 or /SOC 2 auditor. Just to get that understanding, because a lot of these reports don't even come until August or September of each year for our 9/30 year-end clients for a lot of these audits. So we want to talk to them really early, so we could plan better. What does each layer really include, and to ensure that we're scoping our audit correctly and we're not missing any key risks as we go through the process.
Thank you for that, Phil. While we're at it, there's so many acronyms around cloud, and for good reason. These phrases get kind of long. Could you just remind us the difference between SOC 1 and SOC 2?
Yeah. So SOC 1 is a financial-based report. It's a report that if you're let's say a cloud provider or any third-party provider, you don't want 20, 30, 50 auditors asking you the exact same questions and over and over. So the thought behind it is, if you have financial transactions you're processing on behalf of somebody else, or even infrastructure, you're hosting infrastructure, which has a financial relevant application on it. You do a SOC 1 to have one auditor in, test your control environment, given it actually an opinion, an AICPA opinion statement, and then you give that to all your auditors. So all your auditors will then will be able to understand the description of system, what is included in this environment. And description of systems broad is not a system, it's the entire process surrounding what you do. And then each control objectives, and control objectives might be, access control, configuration management, segregation of duties, something around, many other around there. And then if you're like a I don't know, ADP, which processes payroll, you might have just control descriptions on business processes as well, actually processing of a transaction. And so as a auditor, those reports are so critical for me to understand just the scope. What do they do? And especially what do they not do? And inside there, it's getting really complicated because I have one SOC 1 report this year that has subservice organizations, which means they outsource other things. And that subservice organization also outsources other things. So they also have a SOC 1. So when you get that SOC 1, you might need to get, 3 to 5, if not more, additional SOC 1s to do that scoping. And that's why I say this needs to be considered in planning, not in August, September, you get the SOC 1 report and you're like, oh my gosh, this is a lot bigger and more complicated environment than I even considered. That's not the time to figure that out. So that's just a high level SOC 1. SOC 2 is more broader. There's trust principles with the SOC 2. Like a trust principle could be security, privacy, availability, etc. And again, same concept. I don't want 50 auditors in my environment asking the same questions. I want one auditor. I'll have a report, around AICPA standards, governs the context of it. I give that report out to all my user entities, and that's how they should get an understanding of my environment.
Well, that's quite the SOC soup. So it sounds like the key is to get on it as soon as possible.
Yeah.
So Jason, do you want to comment on how would you handle differently an environment where the cloud systems, the cloud are on-prem, they're local versus public?
Sure.
Sure.
I mean, of course, if it's on-prem at the client site, then that the responsibility of the controls would be the responsibility of our client, and we would be realistically testing the full gamut of the controls. The controls being whatever, again, to what Phil said earlier, what is the scope of the audit? So we will be focusing on those controls that that our client owns and responsible for within an on-prem cloud, whether from the whole stack, from the OS, the database, the application, the identification layers. Of course, if it's off-prem, that's what, and I think it was mentioned in the prior session, really looking at, well, what is the customer responsibility matrix? What are the controls that are the responsibility of the CSP versus the customer, the agency? And then to what others have said, Phil has said, if there's multiple cloud provider CSPs, will looking at multiple customer responsibility matrices and really looking at the true framing of what is the responsibility of our client, and then of course making sure that we are fully assessing those controls, fully understanding, and then also understanding getting the SOC 1, getting the SOC 2 to really have that opinion on the design and operating effectiveness of those controls that our customers are inheriting.
Okay, well, thanks. In how about environments where there's multiple cloud service providers involved? How do you typically handle that, that mix? Because it's a bit, everybody has their own nuances. So
right. Yeah, there's definitely the nuances as far as, you might have one CSP that's just managing the IaaS layer, the infrastructure, another one handling the OS layer, and maybe another one handling the database layer, or vice versa. Again, making sure to understand in the context of whatever our objective is for our audit, whether it's an FSA, FSMA, maybe we're doing a contingency plan, performance audit, and so forth. Truly understanding what is the scope, what are the key risk controls that we care about for that objective, and then really drilling down into, okay, well, what is the responsibility of our client from our agency, and then what are the controls that they're inheriting. Okay, is for those that we're inheriting, does a SOC 1, SOC 2 exist, and then also peeling back, when were those controls assessed, or from a coverage perspective, or were they assessed within the period of performance of our audit? If they were performed, assessed, and it maybe they weren't assessed at all this year, but they were assessed maybe the prior year, well, then in essence we would have a gap. We wouldn't know, okay, for this current fiscal year, for this period, what are the controls truly designed effectively? Are they operating effectively?
Interesting. Well, we can come back to that, because I wanna bring in a little bit of a conversation regarding security, and perhaps Danny can get us a little bit of an introduction to how he approaches security across the cloud stack.
So first and foremost, I think Phil hit it on the head, especially when we think about how to audit the cloud. Scope is hyper important. So CSP responsibilities aside, what you guys are doing as an organization and understanding which workloads are running where. And just to give you an example, Noel, like in a hybrid cloud situation, and I'll just throw out a hypothetical where we're seeing a lot of clients actually move to GCP because they're seeing that GCP has some advanced analytics capabilities, ease of use, etc. Meanwhile, they're running conventional storage, compute, typical infrastructure services on AWS or Azure. So when we think about scope, understanding the architecture first and foremost is arguably the most important in the planning phase, because interconnectivity, the network management that needs to happen, having data flow between different cloud environments at on a picture or bird's eye view level will be the starting point. Then figuring out what do you actually want to test, gain assurance on, as far as, do you want to look at data ops, how you guys are actually managing the flow of data, test data, doing the analytics, reporting, visualization, etc. Do you want to test the workloads? Do you want to test the interconnectivity in between? Do you want to understand really how workloads are being deployed? There's a range of aspects. I think from a security perspective, where we start and where we try to understand is actually how things are set up, how they're functioning. And then the question we're asking ourselves is, how can we leverage what's there to make it secure by design per se, right? So when we think about native security services, native capabilities, and then the people, most of the engineers that we work with, and I'm talking about your infrastructure engineers, your sysadmins, the developers who are actually building software, they will do the security work for you, but they need to know what they need to do, and they need to have access to the tooling to do that. So I think a lot of organizations right now are struggling just from a cultural perspective to, I want to say, relinquish the reins. So you have these, really strong bureaucratic security shops that are always skeptical. We have our tinfoil hats on naturally, right? But if you look at a lot of the elite, what I would consider the elite cloud performers, what they're doing is they're asking themselves, how do we leverage the development teams and the engineers who are actually doing the work on the ground and providing the guardrails? So we shift our security program from this like back office, bureaucratic structure where teams have to wait to more of a self-service option where the developers can go, they initiate a scan, they get the feedback, they fix the issue, and they essentially become our frontline engineering team. And then our security program evolves into more of a think of like a second line monitoring function. We're looking for anomalies, you could say groups that are not getting the behaviors we want, breaking the guardrails. And then when the auditors come in, the controls shift, right? So as we introduce more automation, more standardization, we're showing the auditors from an integrity standpoint that we have these controls set up, they're automated, nothing has changed. So rather than them having to test some manual-based process, it's really just looking at the system and the records therein. Hopefully that helps initially.
Yeah, okay, so just to be clear, some of your discussion was perhaps more from the standpoint of the CSP, perhaps? Did I understand that correctly? Or are you seeing this more from the auditor side?
This would be, so like we do a lot of work with in our clients' internal audit teams, or the think of second line risk management teams. So if you have a GRC structure in place, who are seeking to gain assurance. I think you can rely on the provider only so far, right? Like if you go look at the vast majority of breaches that are occurring and major events that are out in industry, it's usually the cloud consumer who has misconfigured something, they mishandled something, they put data in some external repo or some SaaS product that may or may not have been authorized. The providers, I mean, I have pretty high confidence in what the providers are doing. And it, like, from a transparency standpoint, I think you heard Jeanette and Susie talk about it. Like, it's not like they're hiding everything. They give you all the blueprints you need to secure the system. It's just behaviorally, most organizations don't have the operational discipline or the tooling, or they don't understand how it works.
Okay, interesting. So what are some of the types of tools do you use in your security testing?
Yeah, so I would encourage you guys, depending on which cloud you're running on and which provider you're working with, to really look first and foremost at their native tooling, because most of them at this point have adoption frameworks, migration frameworks, and then control frameworks that come along with it. So if we, from the very start, right, one of the things that we've learned in the last couple years is the importance of just account structure. So when you're actually setting up your cloud environments for the first time, reducing blast radius. So what does that actually mean? It means how many apps, workloads, data sets are we concentrating in a given cloud account? So and think of the cloud account as it's twofold. Like, one of the fundamental shifts was we used to have this, network perimeter that was pretty well defined. Well, then we moved to the cloud. We have multiple perimeters because you have a SaaS product over here, you've got infrastructure over here, you have platforms over here. Second part is all these different providers. Now you have an access boundary as well. So, I think it was Brad was talking about the importance of IAM and how difficult it is, and I wholeheartedly agree with him, because right now there's really not a great solution out there. So that's the first part, is really starting with the account, the org structure, like essentially the guardrails. How much are you going to concentrate within a given account? Then we start to move through the actual services. So, like, the way I think of the cloud is it's a whole bunch of awesome engineering services. So if you want to do blockchain, there's a service for that. You want to do machine learning, there's a service for that. If you want a database, there's a service for that. But us as risk and compliance and security professionals need to make sure that these services are configured and hardened and sandboxed in a safe way. So the first part is process. The second part is the tooling that goes along with it. So when we think about how these services get hardened, set up, configured, you can define that in policy directly with the provider. And then we use tools such as infrastructure as code. Think of if you're running multi-cloud, HashiCorp, Terraform, and then Sentinel for policy as code, where we actually take the deployment rules. So you say, okay, you want an EC2 instance in AWS. Here's how it's set up. Here's how it's configured. Even if you want an account, if let's say you're setting up a new account, we'll also have a script that will deploy that account for development team, give them the resources. We then automate those checks using policy as code. So it's essentially infrastructure as code, checking infrastructure as code. And yell at me, guys, because some of this gets abstract. It almost like what's the movie Inception? We're going into layers here. So first and foremost is and I think the golden rule is, like, where you can automate it, where you can remove toil and the manual process, do it using, and the providers offer native capabilities. So in Azure, it's Resource Manager. In AWS, it's CloudFormation. If you're thinking multi-cloud, I would encourage you to look at tools like HashiCorp offers. And then, so then we get our services set up, and now you've got this kind of safe place to play. You'll hear of a tool called Cloud Security Posture Management, which right now it's doing a lot of the controls testing. So what Phil and Jason were talking about, where say you want to analyze against NIST 853, you want to analyze against PCI, you want to analyze against HIPAA. These CSPM tools are pre-configured, and they're looking at the policies within these services to provide the feedback you need as an auditor or risk team or security team to understand what's misconfigured. So we've actually been using these CSPM tools in audits where the audit team will say, hey, rather than us like going and doing this interview based, can we just select, and really you can test as much of the environment as you want. You can test hundreds of cloud accounts. So you'll have more visibility than ever before as an auditor from a budgetary standpoint with the greatest efficiency. So the CSPM tool gives you visibility into the posture over services. So just envision services, service meaning IaaS, PaaS, SaaS. Then actually I should couple that. SaaS right now is a bit of a gap from a CSPM perspective. There's some tools out there that are emerging, but still a ways to go. Then the next question is again, getting back to scope, how far do you want to go? Do you want to test the actual app or workload? Do you want to test the platforms on the apps and workloads? And when we think about that, that's where the whole I'm sure you guys have heard this, but CI/CD pipelines come into play, the level of automation, understanding what the development teams are doing, where the handoffs are from the infrastructure folks, and the tools in between. And really, if they set up the pipelines correctly, you can use the pipelines and the native development tools to start to get a picture on how well they're running, who has access to what. Some of the controls from an audit standpoint shift where, in the past you would look for like a release manager, there's some manual approval, but in this world, in this modernized cloud world, there's likely a machine with rules that are set up. Think of like Jenkins, TeamCity, or I'm just naming off a few tools. And again, the providers have their own native pipelines you can use. But again, we're getting into the system and testing real live data so that you guys as an auditor aren't sitting in a room hypothetically going through a walkthrough and then having to go through this sample-based exercise. So I'll pause there. I know that's a lot initially, but
yeah, you you rattled quite the list of tools. So thank you for that. So let's mix it up a little. So Phil, how would you what do you expect your auditees to be doing in terms of monitoring CSP performance and their control environment?
Yeah, so that's key because what Daniel went over was great. I mean, the point here is, man, this is complicated. This is not easy. So what I would say about 3 to 4 years ago, it was pretty immature, right? We would come in as auditors. We would say, hey, how are you monitoring your CSPs? What do you mean? We've transferred all of our risk. That's your job, right? Like, no. That's not our job. That's your job as management to monitor them. We're trying to look at your control program. So we do expect our auditees to have a control program to say, okay, I have different, the software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, whatever it might be, even, for a single app across many areas, they need to have a program. So I think first and foremost is, are they actually looking at the, especially in the federal government space, are they looking at the FedRAMP packages? So at one of my clients where we do consulting work, we set that entire process up. Where we get the FedRAMP package, we have a process to review it, look for issues. And the key here is, this might be a shocker, but all FedRAMP packages aren't clean, right? It's not like, oh, there's no problem here whatsoever. And also what I've noticed is there's a lot of time a disconnect between, okay, so you have a CSP that's implemented a subset of controls based on whatever it might, based on, let's say, NIST 853. Just because they've implemented a certain way doesn't mean it meets your policy. So now there's a gap, maybe, obviously simple stuff like, we recertify users, administrative users quarterly. Well, maybe your policy as an agency is monthly. So what do you do with that gap? Yeah, it's not just, oh, whatever, that's just a CSP, it is what it is. No, you probably need to do an assessment. So this is where the process comes in. Looking at all the policies and procedures they're complying to based on the FedRAMP and then associated SOC 1 or SOC 2, and then saying, are there gaps? All right, great. What do I do about those? So we want to see as their auditor, they've actually made an educated decision. All right, for this gap, we've looked at the risk. The risk is really small. We're not doing anything about it. For this other gap, we've developed a plan of action, a milestone, or POAM, and we're working with CSP to actually change that setting or something to that effect. So that's also really important as well. So I think that's really the key is looking at the processes around that and then getting the understanding. And then, which is I think been mentioned a couple of times, the CRM, the customer responsibility matrix. What are now you responsible for? Great. I've looked at the FedRAMP package. I understand what they're doing. I see the gaps between their IT security policies and mine. But now I have my own thing I need to do. Now we want to make sure they have a program to actually do it. So if we're the first ones asking them, hey, I see that you have a responsibility for recertifying your own users if you get access to the SaaS, and that's the first time they've heard about it, there's a problem. That shouldn't be my job as an auditor telling you that you need to do this. They should have a process. We should be testing their process and not be training them, basically. So that's kind of, some of the, just a short summary of kind of some expectations of management.
Bit of a tough love approach.
Yes.
I can see some interesting dynamics in debriefs. Jason, do you have anything to add? A different, angle on?
Yeah, I mean, I would.
From clients?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that almost the same thing as Phil. At the end of the day, they can't just pass the risk to the CSP. They need to determine, well, what are those controls that the CSP is doing, and are they aware of, one, are they aware of those controls, and two, are they aware, well, when was the last time those controls were even assessed? Yep. When were those controls determined to be effective and operating effectively? And again, similar to what Phil said, the CSP might have determined that, yeah, they were operating effectively, but were they aligned with what our customers' local policies are, and and maybe there is a gap, and what is our client and our agency doing to monitor? Maybe are they doing maybe some additional monitoring just to reduce any additional risk?
Right, interesting. So for the three of you, from your standpoint, I guess let's start with Danny. Do you think the organizations you're auditing are handling the responsibilities and the transition to cloud services well from the oversight point of view? How do you see that? You see a glass half full, half empty?
I see it glass half full. I think a lot of organizations, there's really two opposite ends of the spectrum. There's on the left side, we'll call it the slow side. There's the organization that goes into the cloud and they're so risk averse, they're almost hurting themselves from a business agility standpoint because they're not harnessing and really leveraging the power of the cloud. On the right-hand side, you have the organization that it's like complete opposite, and there's no controls. It's kind of willy-nilly. Everything seems to be moving organic, and it seems like pure chaos. Most organizations are somewhere in the middle. They're kind of getting their feet wet, trying to figure it out. And what they're coming to realize is that a lot of these legacy processes, team structures, reporting channels create friction in the cloud, because frankly, everything is just easier to consume and use in the cloud. So, which creates risk, right? From a risk and compliance perspective, because you'll see sprawl, you'll see shadow IT pop up, you'll see data showing up where it shouldn't be. You'll see apps and workloads that may not be deployed the way they should be. So what organizations are doing, right, is, and I think they're taking a calculated approach, and what we've been encouraging them on is there's this natural urge and tendency, especially depending on your leadership team, to really push to go faster. But sometimes I think you got to move incrementally. And I hate to sound cliche, but like using an agile approach where you're biting off the cloud in small chunks, proving that it works, figuring out what went wrong, course correcting from an operational standpoint, and then applying those solutions forward to each product team and going on a team by team basis, depending on how you guys are structured. I think a lot of organizations are getting there, and frankly, like, the vast majority of organizations are not, running in the cloud entirely. There's only, like, if we look at industries, tech, most startups, so like some media, retail, fintech, the vast majority of financial services are still taking a very, kind of calculated approach. And then if we think about like critical infrastructure sectors, like power and utilities, very low exposure. Most of them have very low exposure. So I think once we get these lessons learned, and if you go and look at like what the providers are doing now, I mean, again, they have so many methodologies, so many frameworks. It's really just a matter of reading it and being able to consume it. I'm confident that things will get better, and you're going to see organizations run more disciplined. Where I am skeptical, though, is just people's natural tendency and reluctance to change, because the cloud definitely forces you into more of a kind of a team mentality, where security you don't have a choice. You have to work with the architecture group. They have to work with the engineering group, because if they don't, they're going to move too fast. Things are going to get out of whack. And then vice versa. If security is coming too heavy handed, you're slowing down the team, you're hurting the business, they're not making revenue. And really the solution there is just how we work together. So that technical processes aside, I'm confident. I think it's just getting through the cultural barriers that is super important.
And I can add to that, Noel, if
Go ahead.
throw something in there. So actually, for me, I'm actually nicely surprised of how well, at least on the federal government work, how well they're moving. I mean, there's some things that I've seen that my clients do that I'm shocked that they've moved this fast. For example, there's a product out there called SYNAC, which is cloud source penetration testing. And when I heard so these are entities where they say, okay, we're going to give you, in this example, a IP range or an area. We're going to put it all through our portal. And these people are not cleared by the federal agency. They're cleared by SYNAC in this example, but they're not cleared. And from my understanding, the DoD and civilian agencies are using this because they've made a risk determination that it is more risky that I have vulnerabilities that bad actors could get to than it is the risk that this person will be a bad actor going through this very secure portal to do this penetration testing. So I've been to a number of presentations on that. I've been highly impressed that people's actually moved to this. And then, with other examples as well. So I think it's exciting that the government is moving this fast in there. But what it means is audit professionals, kind of the whole concept of change, man, we got to keep up. And some of our approaches of auditing, I think, are still antiquated. And we gotta, as a profession, continue to move to, automation and rather than sampling. We still do sampling a lot of my audits, where it's like, wow, haven't we got to the point where we can automate this and basically, which in better terms, substantively test it more rather than continue to do samplings? Hey, let me get a population select of 45, and maybe hopefully out of the million things I could have sampled from, I'll actually catch something. So that's where, as a profession, I think because our clients are moving, that we also got to move as well.
That sounds great. Who would have thunk it?
Yeah.
That we're gonna be actually using risk-based approaches for this. So that's interesting. Jason, it's kind of the same question for you. What's your?
Yeah, I mean, I similar to Phil. I mean, I've been definitely impressed with a lot of my clients. They've been moving quicker to the cloud more seamlessly than what I had originally expected, and it's been encouraging, and it's been exciting just from an audit profession. Then of course for us, keeping up with them and getting ahead of the curve, and as we're modernizing our approach as well. But and I think we've been talking about this theme throughout, is making sure that at the end of the day, they move to the cloud very seamlessly, very smoothly, but are they effectively understanding what their risk points are? And so still making sure that they understand those parts. I mean, I think for most vendors, most clients, it's still a learning curve, but definitely have been impressed with the speed of it.
Well, thank you for that. I'm curious to see what you guys think about the penetration of FedRAMP and whether or not that has you see that as a net positive, or are you seeing that more problems with adoption and not really improving your improving security postures across your clients? Danny?
Noel, sorry, can you reframe the
I was
question with respect to FedRAMP? Yeah.
Yeah, you're more about FedRAMP and how have you seen FedRAMP having an impact on the environments you're looking at?
I think overall, like FedRAMP, similar to FISMA, right, has forced companies to take a more regimented approach to the cloud. So it provides a structure. It also provides accountability, which is super important, because depending on the client or the organization, and just to give you an example, we're working with a healthcare startup who's really what they're doing is aggregating and providing advanced data analytics and data ops capabilities, in support of different, you could say, payers, providers, and clinics, so up and down the healthcare supply chain. And they were very much, I would say, nascent from a security perspective, and they started to pursue a federal client, and one of the requirements was specifically to be FedRAMP compliant. I think it was level 2, I want to say, but it really forced them to kind of get their butts in gear and drive accountability into the organization. Whereas before, like, it was a little haphazard, a little messy. So I think overall impact has been good. And, compliance is like anything else, everything else with security. Compliance is important, but I think good security breeds compliance, whereas just because you're compliant doesn't necessarily breed good security. So, apply the same lens respective to FedRAMP, knowing that FedRAMP provides a great starting point and drives accountability, but overall impact, I would say it has had a good effect.
Okay. Phil?
Sure. No, I agree. So I kind of have two sides of it. So you have to your point, the accountability. So for example, I'm in the project that's actually helping my client implement a SaaS-based GRC tool. So I've actually had to help my client get an understanding of the FedRAMP program and push it through to get CIO approval. So what's great is, they sit on AWS, and a lot of the controls are inherited. They're already got an IL5, which is one of the highest things. They're done. So a lot of the work that me as an end user saying, hey, this is a great tool to help you with compliance, from a GRC perspective or cross organization is great. The tough part now is that day you say, yep, everything's FedRAMP, everything's good, I get everything in line, to the day you actually use it, to me, there's still kind of a gap that's a little long. So to me, what's happening is the CIOs or the functions are still struggling a bit with, their own ATO processes. And what I've noticed is they kind of seem like they're kind of putting everything in the same bucket. So if you're going to an Oracle financial cloud environment that's SaaS-based, that's significant. You're going to be processing millions of transactions in that. But if I'm using a SaaS-based tool that's more for compliance, they probably shouldn't have the same type of, review or assessment to get that authorized. And I still think CIOs are still struggling with that of how do I, just because it says cloud, doesn't mean I need the exact same thoroughness and detail for you to go to that cloud. So that's kind of the things that I'm noticing in at least from a federal government perspective, is that FedRAMP has really sped up the process, everything that Danny said, but it's that last piece so I could say, yes, I could put production data into my SaaS-based tool, but that data is a lot different than other data, so maybe this should go faster. That's what I've kind of noticed that's occurring.
Okay. All right. So what's the last word, Jason?
Yeah, last word. I mean, the FedRAMP has from whatever I've seen, it's been a useful mechanism, methodology for having that strong, consistent framework for determining, okay, is a system, is an CSP authorized or operate, but for those controls that then our customers, agencies are inheriting. But to Phil's point, how does that flow down into the actual agencies? How are they taking those controls, understanding their CRM, the customer responsibility matrix, to understand how does that bleed into their agency's authorization decision? How have they taken in their what gaps there might be from, although it's those controls are effective for that period by the CSP, what gaps still exist from the agency's local policies, and how they mitigated that risk, accepted that risk, monitoring that risk, to then ultimately authorize it for use for their production transactions and business processes.
Okay. Interesting. So we already talked about tools and that being used, and we talked about multiple cloud environments. I see that there are questions about specific ways to relate the results and the impact of having different CSPs, whether or not you do any kind of normalization or you just handle them separately. Could you just talk a little bit about that, just to make sure that we cover questions, Jason? When you have multiple cloud service providers involved.
Sorry, the question is, you have multiple cloud service providers, and what?
Yeah.
What about it?
Some of the questions were about specific ways in which you factor the input and the information you gather regarding risk when you have.
Yeah. So I mean,
the different ones. I mean, do you analyze that? Do you just treat it separately? Some of the ways you approach that.
Yeah. I mean, I can't isolate it or silo them out. I have to look at the full stack, and how does the infrastructure cloud CSP impact the PaaS? How does that impact the SaaS? And holistically, are there any gaps along the way throughout the whole stack? And then again, definitely not isolating them, not looking at them individually, but through the stack. Then how is our customer aware of what the risk is throughout all the different CSPs? Of course, if it's just one CSP, that's a little bit easier. But if there's 3 or 4 or 5 or however many, that's definitely more and more possibly SOC 1, SOC 2. Of course, FedRAMP packages, they need to be monitoring and understanding what are they inheriting, what are their responsibility, and where is their risk points. Okay,
all right, thanks. Phil, you mentioned the SOC 1 and SOC 2. How about CSA's CCM? Is that something that you see coming up, or you have to rely on?
No, I mean, really, for our audits, especially those that are done with AICPA standards or even Yellow Book that require independent review, we're really focusing on the SOC 1 and the SOC 2. And I just saw a question pop up too, is how do you respond to a CSP that say they don't need a SOC 2 because their sub provider handles it? And so that's those early questions in planning, right? That's what we really need to be looking at. It's the scoping and getting an understanding of what is the environment, what are the controls, how are you getting assurance on those controls from an independent entity. So for us, just from an independent audit perspective, the FedRAMP is great, but we actually cannot rely on the FedRAMP for especially our, let's say, financial statement audits. Because that is not an AICPA accredited kind of an opinion. So that's why we always also ask for the SOC 1 and or SOC 2. And most of the large entities, they have it now. I mean, they figured it out. What I've noticed though, is that some of the smaller entities, it is still maturing in that area. For example, I had one entity this past year where they had, so it's third part, so you had to say basically a SaaS type of product that was sitting on and using other people's services, and those services has yet to get a SOC 1 or SOC 2. And since it was inside a federal government, it wasn't a commercial agency, they haven't been pushed there. So it's really hard to get an understanding of the control environment. And then the first year they did a SOC 1, we finally got it in August. This is the end of our audit, and it was redacted. So this is where communication comes in. The whole point of a SOC 1 or SOC 2 is to get an understanding of what they do, what do they not do, and me as an auditor, what kind of controls can I rely on to decrease my risk of whatever my audit goal is. So if an entity redacts their SOC 2 because maybe they don't understand that concept, it basically might as well have not done it. So we had a lot of discussions with management, and one of our key points was this probably should have been known before August or September that you were going to redact it, right? And this is where communication comes into place. You should be having open communication. This is getting better, but there still seems to be this tendency that says, oh no, I can't talk to my cloud provider. I can't ask them questions. I can't have monthly meetings with them. I just get their SOC 1, their FedRAMP, or whatever it's called, and that's it. No, you can have meetings with them. I mean, they're a paying customer. So this to me where communication really needs to be front and center in your program, and really part of everything you do when it comes to risk and all these third-party entities.
Hey, Noel, just to piggyback on Phil's point, oftentimes to fill that gap, and I'll speak more so from a commercial side of the house, but let's say you can't get assurance over a provider, or they just aren't giving you the insight you need to determine what their overall controls look like and what, a base level of assurance that you're expecting. Oftentimes, that's where organizations are leveraging. They typically have some sort of third-party risk capability that goes in, performs, pre and post contract due diligence. And what they're doing, right, is they're either pushing forward a questionnaire. They might go do an on-site assessment. They might have a series of, in this modern COVID world, a remote discussion where we do some screen sharing to show and tell and actually see what's under the hood in order to fill that gap.
Okay.
And that's a great point too, is that, if you have a CSP that's, a problem, I mean, to me, that goes back to legal. What did you put in that contract? Shouldn't you be requiring SOC 1, SOC 2, something to ensure that that the management's covered? And to me, management's not doing that. To me, maybe that, a lot of our audits, we have, entity level risk. That's an entity level risk problem. It may be because there's a disconnect between the entity, the procurement entity that writes the contracts, and then the security function. And we have seen that as well, is that these key T's and C's, terms and conditions, are not being put into those contracts. They really cover management. And that definitely is a finding by itself.
Thank you. And it sounds like it comes down to the old mantra that you can outsource functions and operations, but you can never outsource the responsibility, and therefore you need to understand what your responsibilities are in terms of managing your service providers. So thank you for that, guys. We are kind of almost out of time, and we could keep talking about this topic forever because there's a lot to discuss. But I want to, if you guys can pull out your crystal ball and just think about where things are going in terms of practices, in terms of better audit practices and the tools coming out, and just give us, in 3 years, when we call you back to have another one of these events, what do you expect to be discussing or hope to be seeing? So, and let's start with Jason.
Yeah, I mean, I think 3 years, I mean, definitely more and more emphasis on automation within the audits. Being able to not, I think it was Phil that mentioned it earlier, not just doing the basic sample 45 out of how many the population, but actually doing an automation bots and processes within our audits to really look at the risk points from a more holistic perspective.
Okay, good. Danny?
Yeah, I think 3 years time, right? And what I would we're encouraging everyone is just to get more hands-on with the cloud. And my hope is our relationships if we think about third line, or if you're external audit, internal audit, second line risk management, or first line ops teams, we're all singing the same tune and have transparency. I think the one huge benefit to the cloud, right, is if you want to see what's going on, you'll never have more visibility than you had before, because with the way it's set up, everything being managed through an API, from an auditor's perspective, you should really be able to get as much assurance as you want. Again, it gets back to that scoping piece and making sure that you understand how things work. So my hope is that, us as auditors, security folks, we're able to put kind of this compliance stuff in our rear view mirror. That's like the day-to-day, you could say just BAU, and we start to focus on these emerging types of threats and attacks that are out there, and the emerging technologies as well. Because like my hope is, and what gets me excited is when you start to think about like AI, machine learning, natural language processing, blockchain, containerization, and chaos engineering. Like that's where I get really excited. And the auditor, you guys as the audit team, we're just providing feedback, and you guys are seeing that we're operating within those bounds. So right. The engineering, I think 3 years from now, everyone, maybe not 3 years, but trajectory wise, everyone will be at some base level, some form of an engineer. It's just, okay, what are you doing?
Yeah. All right. Real quick, Phil, you get the last word.
Yeah. So I agree exactly everything what they say, but it's great to be an auditor because compliance is going to get more. So you have FedRAMP on the horizon. You have CMMC. That's another set of compliance standards, especially working with the federal government. So there's just a lot more compliance coming down the pike that we just got to be as auditors ready for and understand. So when we're looking at the cloud, we're looking at our customers, we're doing this auditing where we're changing with the times and understand what's coming down the path. So,
well, guys, on behalf of GWDC and CSA, I really appreciate your input and sharing with all of us all your insights. So thank you very much. And, applause to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Right.
Thanks, guys.
All right, fantastic. Yet another great panel. So we'll take a 5-minute break while we set up for our closing